Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, and wherever you might be joining us. I'm super grateful to be here with Dawn Morrison. Dawn, I've been saying to a couple people who've been asking me, who are you going to be chatting with? I'm like, I'm going to be chatting with one of the smartest ladies I've ever met in my whole life. So I'm just super grateful that you have taken the time to have this conversation. I know you're very busy, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you've been up to. But I'd like to just give you a moment to introduce yourself, if you may.
Thank you. Hochwaidap Koselton, or hello, all my relations. And I just screwed that up. White Hochwaidap. I'm still waking up, if you can see. I'm here in my home territory of the Secwepemc, in my ancestral territory from my mother's lineage. And I'm in her home right now, and they're out in the garden, and I'm really excited to be here with you this morning to talk about the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years to mobilize knowledge and networks around Indigenous food sovereignty, and specifically around our most recent project, the Indigenous Food and Freedom School.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I feel, so this week's theme for this Facebook series is on Indigenous food security, right? So Indigenous food security. So right off the bat, those three words joined together, what does that mean to you, Indigenous food security?
Well, Indigenous food security is, in my understanding of it, and I know that that term was introduced into the global food movement through, actually, I think Vandana Shiva traces it as far back as after the last World War, when the Industrial Revolution or the Green Revolution happened in the food system. And so it's kind of a militaristic term, which is part why I don't use it. I like to nurture a more feminine kind of healing energy in my work. And so, but it's a term that's widely used, and the way I understand it and the way I've seen it being used in the present day reality is the making sure people have enough food for the short term. But I've chosen to focus on Indigenous food sovereignty because I think it's more important to have a more specific approach to addressing the underlying issues of why people don't have enough food, rather than Band-Aid solutions that are around food banks and other type food programs, which are important, don't get me wrong, but it's just, yeah, that's my understanding of it.
And another big question, thank you for that. That reminds me, I think it was in our conversation a while back when we were talking about the term of resource management. Like, this is a term that is used so often. How are we going to manage resources, resource management? And it's conceptually, that's such a colonial, extractive, objectifying way of discussing relationship, right, to land and waters and non-humans. And you were talking about land and as relative rather than resource. And even just nurturing that idea that land is relative, and it's more understanding how we relate rather than how we manage. You kind of pinned that to my attention as well. And so thank you for clarifying. Indigenous food security, very militaristic, kind of have a similar extractive tone, or even depersonalized.
Yeah, and it's not to discredit the people that are doing the work on food security, because I mean, that's the problem with the English language, is that it can be interpreted in so many ways. It's so different from Indigenous languages, the way we speak about it in the higher cultural context in which we understand our food as relatives and the land as our relative, as opposed to a resource to be extracted to an external means, rather than an intimate relationship. So, I know that we use the language, the English language, and many of us do it really important work in that area as well. So it's not to discredit, it's just, I'm all about the radical systems change. And I think that starts with our language. I mean, I think that's the simplest thing we can do to change is our mindset and our language.
What do any other terms come to mind that you've consciously removed from your use of the English language in regards to food?
Yes, it's really important actually to transition out of the production paradigm. So productionist thinking, the mindset, language, terminology, framework on which the whole Western science-based techno-bureaucratic framework for agricultural research and development was developed under a productionist mindset. And so that actually in the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s led to the intensification of production. I'm going to just close the window here. So I'm not sure if you hear that sound in the background.
Yes, we can hear some music. Feel free, close the window. That's great.
Okay.
We'll get back to the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s you were talking about.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. Somebody was listening to Joy to the World. All the boys and girls. So the Industrial Revolution, when the production paradigm was first instituted as a way to mechanize and intensify production, which in turn has led to the establishment of a huge corporate empire that's reached the limits of its growth. We're seeing that in the global land and food system, but also in the Western science-based resource management system. The level of extraction, the level of decline of the health of humans and ecosystems has never been the levels that we've reached now. So it's really important that we find new ways. And again, humans, we're full of infinite potential. And I think changing our mindset is super important. So transitioning to a regenerative food system based on a decolonizing our minds, our bodies, our souls, our relationships, and moving to a more regenerative, life-giving, holistic health narrative.
So can you tell me a little bit about the work that you've been involved in, like you said, over the last decades, and how you've been able to do some of that decolonial, regenerative work personally and in your, professional life or in your work?
Yes. Well, we've developed a framework. We call it a Decolonizing Food System Cross-Cultural Interface Framework that we use to give structure and some tools, some terminology to be able to create culturally safe spaces for Indigenous peoples to have our voices and our visions heard in food systems discourse, because the agricultural narrative that dominates the research and development in agriculture, which is the global food system, we've been made invisible in our Indigenous subsistence economies and cultures, our hunting, our fishing, our farming and our gathering, our narrative, the way we have subsisted for thousands of years. Really, the agricultural food system that was established about 10, 12,000 years ago, when they first started domesticating plants and animals, humans, Indigenous people, had been living the reality of food sovereignty prior to that, and actually contributed a lot to that, but that's not been the story that we've heard, or that's not been very favored at all in the more kind of white supremacist narrative that favors that model and that economy, their thinking, their mindset, that Western mindset. So that's really important work that those are often very contentious conversations. And so we felt we needed to create a framework to create safe spaces and to really be able to say that this is this kind of change requires that we as Indigenous people don't carry all the burden in that conversation, and we need tools to be able to say that and to be able to not just identify the points of contention, but also the complementarity, because there is a lot of people of all colors who are waking up to realize that we need to change the system, and so they want to support, and so they're doing things like mobilizing regenerative farming networks, and that's really important. That's complementary. We want to be able to form partnerships with people of all colors who are wanting to make the change and who can support us in our efforts.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you've been involved in most recently?
Okay, well, most recently is the Indigenous Food and Freedom School. And we are still trying to figure out, in times of COVID crisis. Yes, there's our beautiful graphic recording that Wet'suwet'en artist Michelle Bushels, we brought her into a couple of our meetings, and she's actually a cohort member. We've engaged 2 cohorts with our Indigenous Food and Freedom School to help us develop, test, and evaluate it. And one of the cohorts is in Vancouver, and it's we've been recently awarded a residency through the Vancouver Parks Board at Strathcona Park in East Vancouver, and we know that Strathcona Park and the downtown east side of Vancouver are among the most poverty-stricken, food insecure neighborhoods of all of so-called Canada. And so we intentionally have been working with a cohort of Indigenous people and settler friends and allies that are showing up in mutual aid and solidarity to support us. And we're engaging a cohort in my home territory here in Secwepemc, and that's a picture of the land where we've acquired 4 acres to start our own growing of fruits and vegetables. Yes, and there's Cheryl from our Vancouver cohort who brought me a beautiful gift of dandelion roots. And Cheryl works for the Two Wash Garden project run by Vancouver Native Health Society at UBC Farm. So our cohort members are Indigenous peoples that are doing amazing work, all of them. And it really is a network. And we've specifically invited people that are doing awesome radical work. And so they're helping us to inform. This is never just me or just the working group. It's always the strength of our work really lies in our networks. So I want to say about the Chase site here, the picture that you see, in addition to the garden, prime agricultural land that we will be farming on, or we're just actually having a work party on Friday and Saturday of this week to start planting, and just in the little gully behind that garden, we've got elk coming back to our valley. So we're working with a nature-based conservation planner to help us develop a plan and a proposal for a nature-based conservation plan that we will call the Secwepemc Foodlands Conservation Area, and establish an area that says, this isn't just about agriculture. Of course, the agriculture is important, and we We're going to take care of that agricultural land. But it's also about mapping out and advocating for the conservation of our elk and our wild salmon in a much broader ecological and cultural scope and scale than what the colonial system was designed for in agriculture.
Mm-hmm. So is that work, that project, the Indigenous Food and Freedom School, was that done under the umbrella of the Indigenous Working Group, or is that something separate, obviously connected?
Yes, it was. It was an idea that was, pun intended, spawned out of the last 15 years that we've been organizing time and space for Indigenous food sovereignty. Research and action and policy analysis. And so the Indigenous Food and Freedom School is really what we've heard. Some of the thousands of Indigenous peoples that we've spoken with say to us that we need a living reality of food sovereignty, like Indigenous food sovereignty. It's not just a concept. It's not just a research project. It's actually something. It's participatory. We need to be actively on the ground, upholding our sacred responsibilities to the land, to the plants, the water, the people, the animals that provide us with our food, and participating in a day-to-day basis on land-based activities and teaching our children and restoring our cultures and learning our language around it. And so that's why we've said, okay, we've done a lot of policy influencing and talking in meetings and organizing all kinds of meetings over the years and conferences. But now we want to live the reality. So that's what Indigenous Food and Freedom School. We are developing a toolkit, which will aim to launch in 2020, which will be written tools from basically the last 15 years of analysis to support other people to go out and grow their own network and become leaders within their own circles of influence. So we can really scale up the capacity of our work and do it in a deep and meaningful way that resonates with our cultures and our systems. So
and I'm seeing here, Dawn, I mean, this graphic, I want to really go through it later. It looks so interesting. I mean, I love these kinds of graphics. I think they're a really good way for us to learn and gather our thoughts. I'm seeing this well-known fact here: Indigenous peoples maintain 80% of the world's biodiversity. I think that's something that we need to really think about. You know, Indigenous peoples globally maintain and protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, whereas the population of Indigenous peoples is much smaller. What does that mean, that Indigenous peoples are able to maintain biodiversity through, you know, culture, law, relationship networks? What does that mean for you?
Well, it means we play a very significant role in finding solutions to the present day reality of the social and ecological crises that we find ourselves in, as well as the health crises. When we look at COVID-19, when we look at, you know, in my home territory here, we're really always on the front lines of some of the biggest problems. Like right now, we've got huge industrial agriculture projects coming in right on the banks of the Thompson River, which is a major tributary to the Adams and the Fraser Basin, which was once one of the largest spawning grounds for salmon in the world. We're seeing them dwindle literally to hundreds, where it used to be millions. So, you know, we have knowledge and we have networks. We have ancient wisdom. Our Wild Salmon Caravan is the third component of our work that is really it's about celebrating the spirit of wild salmon, but it's about mobilizing intertribal networks and knowledge that live within those intertribal networks. All along the river, Indigenous peoples have tremendous amount of knowledge and wisdom about, it's actually the system and the politics killing wild salmon. And we know how to do it differently, and we play a really important role in that. Mm-hmm. Yet the system is favored, the established bureaucracies have millions of dollars to run those agencies, and we're grassroots people on the front lines and mm-hmm. trying to scrape together even how to respond to these mm-hmm. some of these campaigns and things that we're saying. And so, but I know that there's researchers, and so our work and how we've come to know all this is, I mentioned earlier, we've spoken with literally thousands of Indigenous peoples across Canada, but we've also done, we've recruited Indigenous scholars and researchers who have looked at the literature and have pointed us in the right direction of some of the literature to support what we're saying. And so I'm aware of, there's a researcher out of University of New Mexico, Dr. Victor Toledo, mm-hmm. and he did a study called Indigenous Peoples and Biodiversity. And he's mapped out the areas of the world with the remaining areas of biodiversity, mm-hmm. and showed that those are also the areas where Indigenous people still hunt, fish, farm, and gather. Mm-hmm. And so it shows the overlaps. I know other organizations have done that as well with like lingua and language diversity, and showing how Indigenous language areas that are still surviving are also the most biodiverse. Indigenous peoples make up only about 5% of the world's population, mm-hmm. yet we maintain 22% of the world's land mass and 80% of biodiversity. So, mm-hmm. yeah. So, even in this colonial reality we live in here in so-called Canada, as one of the top 4 colonized countries in the world, mm-hmm. Our hunting and our fishing and our gathering still persists. We've never mm-hmm. lost that. We mm-hmm. still have subsistence economies that we try to keep going, but with decreased access to land and mm-hmm. Having to be participating in this capitalist economy it changes the way we do it, but we are adapting, and we see that our part of what we're doing with the Indigenous Food and Freedom School is to intentionally connect up with the global network of mutual aid networks who are mobilizing around the world to kind of move away from a predominantly capitalist economy. Mm-hmm. And so that's it's not just Indigenous people that are doing that. There's some amazing work happening that has been informing how do we cross-fertilize our subsistence with the reality of needing some money in a just transition to our culture where we would need less money and just have our basic needs met. Mm-hmm. But that's a big transition, and we're, again, we create tools to make that easier and to mm-hmm. just be a bit more mindful of how we do it in a way that's realistic and not causing too much more stress than what we're already dealing with.
I mean, you would have thought being here in these territories, right, in the so-called South, right, the so-called global South, which is just a matter of perspective, which way you're looking at a map. But here in the South, you think the Amazon being on fire for weeks and weeks and weeks was a wake-up call. But it seems, and especially that's super linked to the agribusiness, global agribusiness, and how big agribusiness is here in Brazil, and how those interests take over Indigenous land rights and are threatening Indigenous territories and the continual demarcation here. And it's all connected. Have you been connecting with folks here in Brazil or, across Central South America?
Yes, well, actually, the very first international gathering that I went to on the topic of food sovereignty was in 2006 in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And it was at the university there, and there was a gathering called, it was organized by the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, and a gathering called Forum on Land, Territory, and Dignity. So I had went and carried the voice and learned about the framework that they were working with, so that I could come home and work with a group of women who helped me to guide me, to direct me, to support me in the very first Indigenous Food Sovereignty conference that we organized at the Anaukan Center on Penticton Indian Reserve. Jeanette Armstrong and Janice Dick-Billy, Suzanne Johnson, and Kathleen Neen, one of Canada's leading members of the food security movement. So that report that came out of that conference was amazing, how we still refer to it today, how relevant that work was. But the gathering in Porto Alegre, Brazil was instrumental, basically, for me to understand the framework and what people are saying about food sovereignty. And so at that gathering, we prepared a declaration and presented it to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization at the parallel event that the FAO was having at the same time. So, we've also we've been invited to represent to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in Cusco, Peru, at an international experts seminar in 2009. I think that was. I'm getting my years all mixed up. And UNESCO has also recognized our work on our methodology for community engagement. We've been awarded food sovereignty, honorable mention for Food Sovereignty Prize with the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. And so our work really has spanned international. We think of it as international even without even leaving so-called BC or Canada, because if we recognize the sovereignty of Indigenous nations living within the nation state of Canada, then we recognize the sovereignty of, we don't define our work by the arbitrary colonial boundaries. We look more at the Indigenous territories and what maybe some of the old prophecies or old teachings around how we describe those relationships. So I know I answered more than your question there, but that's
great. That's wonderful. Can you tell me, on the ground with the food farm school that you've been involved in, what exactly is taking place in community? Can you tell me, like, what exactly is being grown, what kinds of seeds are being planted, and what will that mean in the short and longer term?
Yes. Wow. It's been amazing. I go back and forth between Vancouver and Chase because we're doing work in both places. And so on tomorrow and Saturday, for 2 full days, we'll be having some of our cohort members come to help us plant or start planting and planning our year's work. And so the land on Niskanen Reserve in my home community that you showed a picture of earlier, that is being plowed today. And one of our hunters, Sean Billy, is our chase coordinator. So him and Stephen Teed, another one of our community members who's been really supportive and active in supporting community members to plow up their fields. So we've been gathering seeds many are heritage varieties of cross-pollinated seeds, heritage seeds. So we are going to be developing the planting plan with the cohort. And we have actually more than one garden site. We have a garden site in Sorrento. I mentioned Kathleen Neen earlier, who her husband and herself, Kathleen passed away about 3 years ago, sadly. But her husband, Brewster, is still alive, and their daughter has taken over the land that they were stewarding in our territory on 10 acres in Sorrento. And the Brewster and Neen had written about 8 books on the topic of the industrial food system and the problems with it. And they have a monthly newsletter that was published online, which you can still access, called ramshorn.ca. Brewster and Kathleen have gone up against some of the big transnational corporations in the food system, like Cargill and Syngenta and Monsanto. And they've been some of my biggest mentors, in addition to my elders in my own community, the late Wolverine and my late Auntie Irene Billy, who said, food will be what brings the people together. And the long legacy of political activism upheld by people like the late Arthur Manuel and his father, the late Grand Chief George Manuel, on what is Indigenous land title and rights. We can't have food sovereignty without land. And we know there's a whole system, colonial system, that supports industrial agriculture and resource extraction that favors them to be able to consolidate the land and the infrastructure and everything they need to do what they're doing. And we don't, and we're still struggling with that. And so this is a huge systemic injustice. And so I can't talk about what we're doing here in my community without paying mention and honoring the people that have taught me and the long legacy. This is emancipation. This is about growing our own food so that we are not being reliant on the corporately controlled food system. We're seeing the economic fallout of the COVID-19 and the climate crisis. We're only just beginning to see that. There's predictions around the economic risks, and so as Indigenous peoples, we know that we need to keep our knowledge alive, and we need to be living the reality. And that is a part of our heritage. The knowledge that comes from doing is exactly what enabled our ancestors to live through the Great Depression of the 1930s, when some of our elders talked about how we weren't hungry then because we knew how to work in community together to grow our own food. And we didn't even have like modern irrigation back then, but yet we were the ones being commissioned by even some of the first settlers who basically would have went hungry if it weren't for us. And I don't say that I realize that saying those things are triggering for people, but I think we're in a very serious situation that this work is. It's about the heritage in the seeds, but it's also about the heritage in our knowledge and in our community and our resiliency. So yeah, we've got some beautiful abundance of seeds that we've been gathering and keeping over the years. And we also have networks and people that are showing up to give and support, and some of it through land at Left Fields Farm with the Neen family, and some of it in our own reserve here. So where also the elders talked about how traditionally people would never have been, our people would not have been by themselves working the field, toiling in the field. We worked together. We would all hop in the wagon and go to one field and stay there until all the work was done. And then everybody would go to the next field the next day. And that was actually the resilience, our economy. That was how it worked, through giving and sharing and trading and mutual aid. So that's what we're doing in a nutshell.
It's no small thing, Dawn. What I love about you, I mean, it makes sense. We talk a lot about interconnectivity, right? And that's Indigenous knowledge as well, Indigenous science. Everything is connected. So it makes sense that your work is in the realm of Indigenous food sovereignty, food freedom, but then also you identify as like a climate activist. Is that right? You work against anti-racism within the food system, like these other terms, because you're saying it's not just about food, it's not just about the economy, it's also about politics, it's also about consciousness, it's also about spirituality. One cannot be separated from the other. So I guess my question for you is, if you were to wake up into a tomorrow that is more food secure, more food sovereign, what are some of the biggest things that need to change today, that would need to change overnight? If you could just dream and emancipate even your own mind, think wildly, what would that look like right now?
It would look like our irrigation system on our reserve would be fixed, and the structures and processes in policy planning and governance would be dismantled, and it would be dismantled by the perpetrators themselves, ideally. That's the biggest vision. I mean, that is the biggest hurdle. We face huge systemic challenges with both food systems and climate change. Both are very complex. And Western science plays a role in it, but it is not the ultimate voice of truth and reason from an Indigenous knowledge, a basis of Indigenous ways of knowing and transforming and changing the world. Our people understood the interaction between matter and energy. Our transformer stories tell us about that. And our creation stories tell us about that. And I feel like it would be great if tomorrow every human being woke up to realize themselves more fully in this, because I feel like many are not awake to it. I think there's a lot happening. People are up, and I don't ever want to, I think it's important to remember that too. There actually are millions of people around the world mobilizing, looking for leadership. And I don't feel the leadership exists within the existing system because of the structural processes. So all of that would have changed into a more cooperative, regenerative, life-giving culture and economy.
What kind of leaders do you look to? I know you've mentioned people from your own community who have really paved the way for the work that you're involved in now, some big names like Arthur Manuel, but what other leaders do you see, either locally or globally, that are inspiring you and have been in the last little while?
I see some amazing matriarchs working in a very spirit-aligned way, and I feel like that is the leadership. In my culture, we call it grandmother's law. Law. And there's so many teachings, and especially right now, because the primary cycle being most impacted by the climate crisis is water. And in my culture, the Secwepemc women embody the property of water. It's recognized. It's revered, that women, we give birth to our babies in water. We, you know, our nature, our characteristics embody water in the way, in terms of the feminine. And, you know, what does that mean as opposed to the more male kind of protectors or defenders? It's a different energy. And so the water is, you know, thinking about the feminine in that, and female leadership, and what is really needed, and also how we can hold up the women, because often when there is a shortage of water or a shortage of food, it's the women to feel it first, because we're the nurturers and the caregivers, and it's not to say men don't feel it. It's just really looking at that more spirit-aligned female leadership. And I know there's some great...
Yes, please. Louder from the back. More spirit-aligned female leadership. I'm taking notes. I hope other people are taking notes too. Yes, Dawn. And that's why I always really value your voice and the work that you do. How have you been able to care for yourself in this time? How are you able to care for yourself to continue to do this work and speak to these truths?
Well, it's about building a community of regenerative practice. So because in this colonial reality that we live in, and not to give all the power to that, because we also live in a reality where our ancestral memories, the knowledge is still within us. It's still within, you know, that reality is, I mean, if I look like my grandmother, why wouldn't I be living a part of her reality? And yeah, so we have, yeah. And so what was your question again? I forgot.
Well, sorry, that just really hit me. You said, if I look like my grandmother, why wouldn't I also be living her reality? Like, why wouldn't I be embodying other traits that are beyond the mere physical? And it's true, because I think, you know, Indigenous people say often, we have the resiliency of our ancestors embedded in our DNA, right? These are realities. There is knowledge that gets passed on through generations. But I think sometimes those ideas can be very mystified or romanticized. And it's like, oh, that's sweet. But no, it's science. It's scientific, you know? And so for you to just make space to say, yeah, but it's more than just the way that we look. It's also the way that we behave and interact, and the knowledge that we carry forward.
Yes. And so building a community of regenerative practice, I feel like it brings our work into the healing domain, because a lot of it feels very political and patriarchal in what we're trying to respond to. It's a patriarchal system of Western science-based resource extraction. It's basically white males benefiting mostly from that when you look at the top 1% of the world. And so to balance out those imbalances in privilege and power, and knowing that the real power is within that core in our bodies, where that enables women to create, make life, to give birth, and enables men to attune. So the men who support us are also, you know, really important to think about their healing, because men are impacted by this system of patriarchy as well. And so the healing is really important. And so I have a strong meditation practice, and I have we have a circle of healers and dreamers, beautiful women and men who support, are either healers themselves or are ceremonial leaders, pipe carriers, to really honor them within our networks and within our work. And when we share space and we share knowledge with each other, it's like growing a field of energy or a field of knowledge that carries over across all time spans, from our ancestors through to us, through to the future generations. And so I know there's stories in my community about my auntie's great grandfather who lived through the last smallpox epidemic, and how he talked about that. So I feel like the fact that we're still here, all of us, means our ancestors lived through an epidemic or a pandemic. And so we can too, if we work with the knowledge in the knowing field. And it's not to say to take a pandemic lightly, it's to say we can do this, and there is, the strength is in our circle and in our healing knowledge.
And in this time of understanding and learning, because a lot of ancient traditions carry the message that, you know, physical pain is connected to emotional and spiritual and mental. And, you know, when you have something going on, a pain in your body, there's another message there, and that pain can actually be a messenger. And so collectively, with this pain, with this, you know, the change of the way that things were going, and like you said, which weren't sustainable, and it's not going to be the only changes, massive changes that we're going to see. There's a lesson, there's deep lessons. And I think you've been embodying and involved in this work for quite some time. Do you feel like people are listening now? Do you feel like there's a stronger interest in these conversations, in what went wrong and how out of balance we were, and, you know, looking to those who have the answers and the solutions available, and who are compiling toolkits like your working group has been, like, we have solutions, we have documents for you? Is there more of an interest now?
Oh yes, we almost can't keep up to it. But again, we're struggling still because we're still vulnerable in the systems of funding. And again, you know, there's systems, the systems that were set up to do what they're doing in terms of that's led us to this crisis, favors a certain narrative and a certain skin color. And so there's a huge growing response, but we need the systems to change more quickly, and namely funders and especially around communications and technology, so that we can use what's appropriate to help us connect more, I guess, more so to the global networks who are looking to our leadership, because there's a huge amount of energy and burden that's carried when you're trying to respond to that as grassroots. And it really needs to be grassroots led when you think of the systemic challenges. And, you know, it's a transition. It's not all gonna, like, we need to be gentle with ourselves in that too. So I'm not sure if that's really answering your question, but there's, they're huge systemic challenges. And I think part of the change, though, and what makes it easier, and this is some knowledge that came to me when I organized some workshops for Indigenous climate action led by Ariel Duranger and some other amazing women, Melina Lewatan, and many others, Ellen Gabriel, Andrea Bastian. I just love those women and what they're doing. But what I learned when I had organized 6 workshops around the province for them, to ask Indigenous communities how can Indigenous knowledge inform the development of a toolkit that ICA is developing. One of the biggest messages that came out in those workshops and interviews with elders was embrace the uncertainty. So
Wow.
unlike Western science, which is all about control, like controlling the experiment, the elders are saying this isn't a controlled experiment. We have to actually embrace the uncertainty like it's our friend. And I think that is part of our resiliency. And we need the systems to support us in that, because that's not the way the systems are designed. So I keep going on about the system, but I don't think we can say it enough right now.
I don't think so either. I mean, I like to make it as clear for folks as possible. We've covered some really important things. The solutions coming out of this are to decolonize everything.
Yes.
One, dismantle patriarchy and dismantle the racist systems that have the oppression of Indigenous peoples embedded in their very nature, politically and through policies. Okay, nourish relationships, support women and spiritually aligned leadership, and embrace the uncertainty. So yes. I knew it. I knew you would answer all of my questions and I would be ready to go. I knew it. I knew you would do that. Thank you so much. Dawn, I have a photo here that I want you to breathe life into a little bit. This is a quote. This is your quote. You know, this is a caption you had on this photo. It says, "This is my health. This is my immune system." So I'm just wondering, just to kind of come full circle in this conversation, can you explain what you mean here, what this represents for you?
Yes. Well, I took this photo when I was walking along the Vedder River in the Stolo territory in the and around near Chilliwack in the Fraser Valley, the Stolo people. And yeah, it was at a time when the COVID lockdown had just changed, and I was on my way back to Vancouver from Chase. And, you know, this kind of light, the land, the water, the smell of the cottonwood trees that were just coming into bud at that time, it made me feel alive. It made me feel like we know that as Indigenous people, we are connected to, in my language, all my relations. The land and the water is not a resource to be exploited to an external means. It's our relative. It's part of who I am. We eat food. The food becomes us. Mm-hmm. The food comes from the land. So really, we're just chunks of the land walking around. And that's the way a self-realization guru put it. Sadhguru is his name. And many ancient shamans and saints and gurus have said that, shamans, medicine people, elders. And so, yeah, my immune system, our strength, our resiliency comes from the land and the sunshine and all the healthy, clean water. And without that, it's, you know, I think that COVID is a wake-up call for us to look at not only where the virus began in the industrial food system, but also the really unhealthy intensification of animals in one area, or people all living in cities. And so we need the fresh air, we need the sunshine, we need the clean water, and we need each other. So that's what that photo speaks to me, was saying to me when I took it.
What are some very easy, practical bits of advice that you might have for how people can be less reliant on the industrial food system, and therefore less invested in our own oppression, their own oppression, and, you know, the exploitation of the land? How can we make small decisions, small and big decisions, to move away from that culture?
Well, build relationships, get access to land. If you live in this city, dig up your lawn. Those lawns consume an incredible amount of water that gets wasted on lawns. And that's a lot of land to grow food. I have in my place in the city, it's a garden about as big as my mom's kitchen table. And I feed myself in salad greens all summer, and I feed myself in seasonal things like peas and beans that maybe don't have as long of a growing season. But, you know, there's a lot we can do with a little. But if we have healthy relationships with our friends and our families and our extended families, our communities, there's a lot of giving and sharing and trading that goes on, and that is really our economy. So those are really practical things, but I think there's just a lot of learning to live with less. I think we've all become accustomed to, or many of us become accustomed to having one of the most comfortable lifestyles ever of humanity, and I don't think we need it all. But I guess there's also campaigns to get involved with for people who have more privilege and power, access to land and technology. Come on out and support us to dismantle the structural racism, to unpack your own white privilege or fragility if you happen to be a white person, or even for Indigenous people. We have healing to do within our own, decolonizing our minds. I love the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird and how he talks about meditation and our rituals, our contemplative traditions around ceremony. And those are practical things we can do, and they really are powerful. We need to trust that and really just continue to find ourselves in that. And and seeing some of the contents coming in from some of the beautiful women who are actually in our cohort, learning what we actually need: water, air, love, shelter, connection with the land, making networks for real. That's Cindy Charlie Boy. Connecting the dots. I saw Sabina say that earlier. Sabina Dennis, Chilcote and Decal women, yes. So, yeah, and just taking care of each other, mutual aid and solidarity. Give land back for people who have land. Give it back to us.
Hey.
We know what to do with it. We and so, yeah, those are some of the top things that come to my mind.
Great, Dawn. Thank you so much. I think last year, from what I heard, at least in the space that I was in, the communities that I was, engaging with, there was this, obviously we've been juggling with this term reconciliation, ? Reconciliation. And this year, I think we heard it from the youth in support of Wet'suwet'en. I think the term 2020 is land back, with everything happening, that message keeps coming up. So thank you so much for your time today. I'll let you get back to work, but I really am grateful that you've taken the time to have this good conversation. Like I said, I made notes, so I'll make sure to share these notes in case it wasn't loud and clear. And I just recommend that everybody continue to follow you and your work, the Food Freedom School, and the Wild Salmon Caravan. And I know things are probably going to be a little bit different this year with COVID measures, but we'll be keeping our eyes on you, and constantly thinking about ways that we can support Indigenous food sovereignty and security and food sustainability for everybody.
Yes. Thank you. We've curated an exhibit that we are mounting at the Strathcona Fieldhouse in Vancouver for the Wild Salmon Caravan. So I want you to all come and see it once it's complete. Things are slowed down because of the COVID. Love you too, Sabina. So just stay tuned for that on our Wild Salmon Caravan website and Facebook page, and indigenousfoodsystems.org. We also have Indigenous Food Sovereignty Circle Facebook page.
Okay, indigenousfoodsystems.org, you said.
Yes.
Right. A lot of really good information.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, I want to say thank you to all of the amazing Indigenous women, healers, life givers, caregivers, the men that support us, the Two-Spirit, LGBTQ, the settler friends and allies, people, you know, standing up to transform some of this darkness. It's a really quite amazing, and it's also important to appreciate that. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Emily, for inviting me and doing this good work. I'm so excited to see the other speakers in this series, because I've networked, and some of them I've worked with some of them, and I just love it when I see more and more, especially younger people coming up and their voices.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, stay tuned. I'll be chatting with Tiffany Joseph in about 25 minutes. She'll jump on at 11:30. And then on tomorrow's Friday, you know Julian Napoleon. He's a part of the working group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. So he'll be giving a wild foods cooking class, all of the ingredients he has hunted or harvested. And, you know, it's hard enough to get him out of the bush to come online for a segment of time. So we're lucky that he's going to be coming out to share. But we have great, wonderful. So we're just going to continue these conversations, and it was great to hear from Just Housty yesterday. And, you know, I just think it's really exciting that there's over 70 families building their own gardens in Bella Bella. I mean, that's just so exciting. These are the stories that I want to hear.
Yes.
Great. Well, you have lots of love coming in, lots of thank yous.
Great. I love you all.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I'll take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.